Hey everybody, Troy here, and welcome to the fourth video in our PowerShell Fundamental series. In this video, as you can see by the title, we're going to dive into PowerShell parameters. Parameters are those wonderful things that give our PowerShell commandlets so much power. They give us the functionality and the tactical, surgical strike nature of allowing us to execute a command that does exactly what we want based on the parameters and the specific elements that we're after. But they can also often be the biggest source of pain as we try to learn PowerShell because quite often they don't behave the way we expect. That's because there are different types of parameters and they don't always interact the way we anticipate, and we have to understand exactly why that is, hence this video. In this video, what I want to do is I want to start by understanding something we call the syntax of a full-form PowerShell commandlet. This is, to me, your goal. You want to be able to execute a command in its full form and understand every single piece of the puzzle to make sure it's doing exactly what it should be doing, and you'll understand exactly why each parameter is there. The reason that you need to know this is because every parameter is different. Some are optional, some are mandatory. Some are named, some are positional. Some can be optional and positional. Some can be optional and named. Some are mandatory and named. And if I'm confusing you, yeah, that's exactly how this can get. It can get squirrely. We also have these ones called switch parameters. Bottom line, let's dive in and we'll make sense of all of these so we can actually start executing some fairly sophisticated commands. All right, I'm going to dive into my ISE. So I'm in the integrated scripting environment. I'm running it as an administrator. My scripting pane is off. My command line, my command add-on is shut down to the window here. And I'm going to start just typing I'm going to start with a command here. Let's go get event log. Log name security. Let's specify a computer name of, I'm going to say let's say there's a server in a world called domain controller 1, a server in the world called domain controller 2, and say maybe an admin PC, followed by I'm going to use a newest argument. I want the newest 50 of them, and I'm going to use the word verbose. Now, you may or may not know what these parameters are, what they mean, but let's break this down. This is a full form syntax of a typical argument. Let's break this down into its pieces. Well, we first off have the commandlet itself, get event log. That's the noun verb syntax, the verb noun syntax that actually contains all the parameters. Collectively, this is referred to as a parameter set. They interact in a special way that we can see in the help to make sure that they all are going to work with each other. You're going to find that as we look at the help, this is something we call a mandatory parameter. It's also a positional parameter. It consists of the name, log name, and the argument security, the explanation of what that log name is. We also have an optional parameter called computer name, followed by a string of information that actually is the list of the computers that I want the command to get the information from. 3 computers, DC1, DC2, admin PC, all connected by a comma, which we would refer to as an array of computers. That's a collection. And this one here, this newest option, is a optional parameter. It's something we call a named parameter that has the argument of the integer 50, followed finally by something we call the verbose command, which is a switch command, which contains no argument, and it is either on or off. Now you're going, okay, Troy, how possibly are we supposed to have known this? Well, let's dive in and see exactly how these things work, where we find this information. Let's start with a simpler command here, and get help on let's do our find friend get process. There he is. All right, I'm going to do my brief help on get process, and I'm going to take a look at the section on my parameters. Okay, so I'm looking at the syntax of what we call parameter sets. Now, first thing that we need to know, all of these parameters are able to be used with the commandlet get process. name, computer name, file version info, include username, input object, all of those are parameters that are associated with the get process command. However, they're special because they are broken into parameter sets, which means this first line is one set. If I'm going to use get process along with the name and computer name and file version info, those are the only parameters that I have to work with in that set. I can't use include username in that set. I can't do it in that command. If I want to use include username, I have to be in this set. That's the only place that I can use it in conjunction with, say, ID. If I'm going to use it here, I have another set there, right below it, that includes include username, but it has to be preceded or working with the string. So you can see that although include username is available to use with get process, I can't use it in all circumstances. So we have to understand that we're always breaking these down into these things called sets. Now these parameter sets are fairly easy because what you're going to do is you're going to pick a set and you're going to work with it. And you're basically going to go left to right, followed by the parameters that it includes, and you're usually always going to be safe. If you don't put parameters, if you don't cross the sets, you're rarely going to go wrong. Now, virtually all of them have multiple parameter sets. The trick is picking the set that works for you, but those are commonly defined in the examples. So now we know, first off, that all the parameters available with a particular commandlet are broken into sets, and we have to stay within the set to make the command work. Now, let's take another look. Let's go back to our get help on that one we were working on earlier. Let's look at get event log. Okay, now get event log, first and foremost, is a much meatier, much more robust commandlet. Gives us a ton of options here, which is why I selected it. You'll notice that I only have 2 parameter sets right here. I only have 2 of them. One is massive, one is small. Okay, now the first thing that we want to be comfortable with is trying to identify these commandlets. Now I'm going to show you the quick and simple way, and quite frankly, I'm just going to repeat that command with my help, only I'm going to add the -full parameter. Now that is a switch parameter. It's either on or off. Unless I add the -full, I'm only going to get the abbreviated help. -full turns on that switch, which means that PowerShell is going to return the entire list of help associated with that command. But in that list is a detailed breakdown of the parameters. And these become really important because this tells me exactly how these are going to work. You can see that the first thing it asks is whether it's mandatory or optional. These two, for example, after, as base objects, those are optional. They are not required. It is false that they are required. If I scroll down, I will see that they're all optional except, there's one, log name. That is mandatory. It is true that that is mandatory. They are all also what we call named. Okay, most of them have these things called named parameters, with the exception of, let's see, there's instance ID and log name. All right, now what does that mean? We're seeing that PowerShell is telling us some are mandatory, some are optional, some are positional, some are named. Let's break this down. First off, let's look at optional versus mandatory. Now, first off, many of this stuff, most of this stuff is optional most of the time. Like get process has no mandatory parameters, which means all those parameters we saw in our syntax, completely optional. I don't have to use them. That's why I can hit get process and get results. If I hit get event log though, I know that I have a mandatory parameter. And if I hit enter here with a commandlet that has a mandatory requirement, it's going to prompt me. So it cannot execute. It says, Troy, I need the log name. That's a mandatory parameter. Therefore, you have to tell me what it is. And there's a variety of them. Let's ask for, say, the security log. There we go. Now I'm going to to sort of intercept that response there. So I can see that most of the time they're optional, some are mandatory. I can tell by looking at the full help. There's another way I can tell. Okay, I'm going to go back to get event log here. Actually, let's use my get help, get event log, and I'm just using the brief one because there's another way I can tell whether they're optional or mandatory. And the way I can tell is these square brackets. Okay, these square brackets, if they surround the entire parameter, these are optional parameters. After date time, optional. As base object, optional. Newest, optional. Source, optional. Everything is optional because they're surrounded by those hard square brackets. Look at log name though. Log name, the entire parameter is not surrounded by those square brackets. Log name, the word is, but the actual parameter isn't, because the parameter is actually this whole thing, which includes the name and the argument, which in this case has to be a string. And so that's what PowerShell is expecting. It's expecting me to type a word there. Sometimes those strings have to have quotes around them, sometimes double quotes. Sometimes they don't need any. As you can see, when we executed this, we just typed the word security. It didn't require that. But that's a mandatory parameter. So the thing we can tell here is that optional, surrounded by brackets. Mandatory do not have that entire argument surrounded by brackets. PowerShell will prompt me if I miss a mandatory command, and it will ignore it unless I ask for it with an optional. Okay, cool. Now, some of these are what we call positional, and some are named. And that's where these next set of brackets come in. And you're going, Troy, why are they all square brackets? I didn't write the program. We know that if the commandlet, such as instance ID, is completely surrounded by brackets, it's optional. I don't need to have it in there to make it work. If it's not completely surrounded by brackets, it needs to be there because it's mandatory, and it will either have brackets around it or not. If it has brackets around it, such as log name, that is what we call a positional parameter. And because it's positional, it means this piece of the argument is optional. I don't have to put it in. It's a mandatory parameter, but whether I put the name or not is optional for me. Compare that to, say, my newest. Okay, the entire parameter is surrounded by brackets, making it optional, but the name of the parameter is not, which means it's mandatory if I run it. That's what we call a named parameter. Let me put this into a bit of context here for you. I'm going to run, let's go get event log. Okay, so I know that there's a log name, and I'm gonna, let's go security again. Okay, let's use the newest command. I'm gonna get the newest, say 5. Keep it nice and tidy. So what I've done here, everybody, is I have used the get event log commandlet with the log name parameter where the argument was security, a string. We know from looking at the help this was a mandatory parameter, and I followed it with the optional parameter called newest. And looking at the help, we know this is a named parameter, and let's see its behavior. Now, because get event log said log name is positional and the log name is optional, I can do this. I can hit, say, get event log security newest 5. Wonderful. It ran exactly the way it expected because PowerShell knows that the first argument is going to be the log name because it's positional. And if you remember, when we looked at the help, we saw that it was position 0, which means it's the first. Remember, our positions in computing go 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. That's the first position. And security, as long as that argument matches what get event log expects, it's going to run. I don't actually have to put the full syntax in. I can shortcut that out. Could I do that with a named parameter? Okay, well, let's take a look. I'm going to, actually, let's add another positional parameter. I'm going to go back to my help. Okay, and take a look here. We also have instance ID. Instance ID is also it's an optional parameter because I know it's surrounded by brackets, but it's also a positional parameter. And when we looked at the help, we saw that this was position 0, this was position 1. Both of these are surrounded by sharp brackets. However, this is mandatory. Log name is mandatory. Instance ID is optional because it's completely surrounded by brackets. However, the word instance ID, the name, is also surrounded by brackets, meaning that it's optional and positional, and it falls at position 0. Oh, I'm getting excited. Let's look at this in practice. I'm going to go back now, and there's an instance ID, 4798. Let's do this. I'm going to add instance ID, 4798. There we go. I want the top 5 that match 4798. Awesome. So I see that get event log now has ran with the log name called security, the instance ID called 4798, and the newest 5 items. Log name, I've just proven, was optional because security, although it's mandatory, it is a positional parameter. It means as long as it's in the first position, I'm golden. Instance ID was also a positional parameter. It's optional, but the word instance ID was optional too, as long as it's in the right position, which means after security. Let's hit enter. It ran successfully again. So that means that positional parameters do not require the naming of that parameter. I can just put them in the order and PowerShell can figure it out. Newest, however, was not a positional parameter. It's a named parameter, which means if I take the name out, PowerShell is going to get confused. And it argued with me in a second. Because what it says is that I know what security is. Because the first position is the event log. The argument matches something I have. I know what 4798 is because the second position is instance ID and I have a matching answer for that. The third thing is a 5. And I don't know what that is, Troy. I don't know. Are you talking name? You talking number? You talking my address? Is this the first digit of my phone number? What's going on here? It doesn't know what to do, and it actually tells me I cannot be 5. So that means that if I want this to run, a named parameter actually has to have the name. I can truncate it, right? I could do that, which becomes very, very confusing. So take a look at this now. Actually, if I were to actually run this command, you see how confusing it's starting to get? I could replace the alias. I could replace get event log with an alias. I can tell it's the security, but I really don't know what that parameter is. I don't know what this parameter is unless I knew I wrote it. And if I don't know NE is short for new or newest, then it can be really confusing. So the positionality matters and the truncation matters. Let's run this now. And let's run this, but let's switch the position of security and instance ID. I know that security has to be at, it's the log name, it has to be at 0. Instance ID has to be the second position. Let's see if I run it like this. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go instance ID. I want to go 4798, and I'm going to go security. I'm trying to tab completion. Security. And let's go newest 5. See what happens. Ooh, see, it hates it. It hates it because the positionality means that get event log is expecting this first position to be the name of a log. And there is no log called 4798. And then secondly, the second position needs to be an instance ID. And it's expecting an integer. There is no instance ID called security. And so PowerShell just pukes this right back at us and stops us from finishing off. So what I can do though is, if I put them in the right order though, I know, let's see, I can go, I know if they're in the right order, they're going to work as long as I follow the rules of positionality. Now, if you're confused by this, don't stress because there's a simple solution to this. Yes, you do need to know which ones are mandatory and which ones are optional, but those are easy because you can see the entire parameter surrounded by brackets. And if you forget a mandatory parameter when you try to execute it, PowerShell is just going to ask you. So you can't really go wrong. Where you can go wrong is mixing up whether they're positional or named. And as long as you follow the rules of naming convention, you can very rarely end up getting in trouble, because although I can't change the order when I use positionality 4798 newest 5, okay, that'll work because I've done them in the right order. If I follow the naming convention, I can put them in any order I want. I can go newest 5 from the instance ID of 4798 from the log name called security. Okay, and the reason that works is because I've given PowerShell every piece of information it needs to know. I've said, don't worry about the order. I'm going to tell you what every connection is. The newest 5, instance ID shall be this, log name shall be this. And then it doesn't matter the order that I want. So the good news is that we can easily tell the difference between an optional and a mandatory, and it's hard to go wrong because if we miss the mandatory, it asks us. We do have the ability of using the positional parameters to shortcut the command. I don't have to have words like log name or instance ID in it because the argument, as long as the argument's in the right place, we're good. But I don't have to worry about that because if I use the full form syntax, I can put them in any order I want, and PowerShell can most commonly figure this stuff out. So the rule of thumb is, if as we learn, use the full form syntax, and you really should be successful most of the time, unless something really weird is going on in terms of the information. And speaking of information, we also have to tell the difference of what goes in those arguments, right? Newest is expecting an integer. Instance ID is expecting an integer. Log name is expecting a string. And some strings are specific. Let's go back to get help one more time on get event log. And let's take a look here at the type of information that PowerShell needs. Log name is expecting a string. Look at how that string is. It's just surrounded by this, which means that it is one item. It is a specific string. Instance ID is expecting an integer. Okay. After is expecting a special format in date and time. Same as before. But look at the instance ID and computer name. Let's go computer name. See how computer name is looking for the word string with 2 brackets in it? Oh no, you're saying more bloody brackets. What do these mean? Well, these mean you are talking about something we call an array. I can have a list of items. So that means this string here can actually have a list of items like DC1, DC2, admin PC, I could have 20 things in that string. It can be a list of items, which means this particular parameter can handle multiple objects. The log name parameter cannot. It has to be one. Computer name can handle multiple. So can source. Message cannot. It has to have one string. You can't have multiple messages in there. I'd have to do it a different way. Okay, so there's a lot to absorb here, but fortunately it's fairly easy to keep it straight. I'll repeat it one more time. Looking at this syntax of the parameter set, you should now be able to tell by looking at the outside brackets whether a parameter is mandatory or optional. Log name, mandatory, because the entire argument, the entire thing is not surrounded by brackets. Instance ID, optional, because the entire parameter is surrounded by hard brackets. So a parameter is either mandatory or optional. That's it. Now, a parameter is also either named or positional. If it is named, such as newest, you cannot use that parameter unless you specify the name of the parameter in it. And that can be truncated, but it has to be there. If the parameter is positional, That means that the actual name of it is optional. I don't have to put it in, provided I put it in the right order, and position 0, position 1 matters. But I don't need to worry about it because I can adopt the full form syntax, which means I can properly define the name of every actual parameter I want to use, and then the order doesn't matter. I just simply put them in, whatever makes sense, and the command should work. Okay, now last piece here, I want to show you these special things called switch commands. Okay, so I mentioned in the very beginning, that first command, we had this one called verbose. Now notice that these switch commands like as base object, or let's see, another one here. Nope, that's it. I don't see any other string commands here. A switch command does not require an argument. I'll give you an example. Let's go back to my help. Okay, I'm going to go get help on my get event log. Okay, so that's a command, that in and of itself, right? I ran this with no parameters. But get help has a parameter. It has one called -full. That's a switch command. If I apply that, I'm actually just telling PowerShell that I need you to turn on this extra element here. There's no argument required. It's not full true or full 1, or it just says do it. And now it's included there. We saw other switch commands such as -online, right? That says display this in my browser, right? Which ran over here, by the way. It was just on the other screen. Lovely. We also saw the one called get help -example, right? These are switch parameters. So simply we're adding something. There's a few other ones that you're going to find really cool. Let's say I want to let's get a service. Okay, and we know that get service has no mandatory parameters. I know that because I can run it. Okay, however, maybe I want to look at something very specific here in terms of a particular service. Well, Spooler is my favorite because I can play with it without wrecking my world. Let's say get service. Oh man, service, and I'm going to ask for the name Spooler. Okay, there. So I've used the name parameter to limit the results to the word Spooler. Well, what would you expect if I did this? What does that tell you about the name parameter? Without even looking at the help, what I'm hoping you can say now is, well, without guessing, without looking at the help, I could assume that the name parameter, it's optional. Okay, I know that it's optional. That's me trying to type or write. It's optional because I didn't need it when I ran it the first time. But when I run it, I don't need the name command, which means it's both optional and positional, which means that as long as it's in the right position, I don't actually have to have it in there, because I can see when I run get service spooler, as long as it's in the right position, PowerShell knows exactly what to do with it. Bad form though, I would say this is so much better. I would say stick with the full syntax, you're not going to go wrong. I know it's running right now. Let's stop the service, and I'm going to use the name. Okay, and you're exactly right. If you're trying to figure out whether a name is positional, or sorry, if it's mandatory or optional, we know, let's see what happens here. Stop service, okay? That's mandatory. I need to know what it wants to stop. PowerShell's just going to stop everything for me. There are mandatory parameters here, okay? And so let's say stop service, only let's use the name Spooler. Okay, so that would stop it. But let's add another let's add a list of other parameters. So here's a whole bunch of fun switch commands here. Let's use what if. Okay, what if says, what if I run this? PowerShell is going to say, if you run it, I will stop the service. I will perform the operation. Do you want me to do it? I'll go, sure. Maybe I want you to confirm the action before you do it. PowerShell says, yeah, sure, I can do that for you. If you want me to perform this action, I will force you to confirm it. Awesome. I could do that. So let's just stop this from running. The other thing I can use is another handy one. Remember when I run some commands, sometimes they don't actually show me that they're running. A very fun one, a favorite of mine, is verbose, which actually asks PowerShell to tell me what it's doing and confirm it using its own language. So I've got 1, 2, 3 new switch commands that I can add in my world to ensure that I can expand what we got. Okay, so we've covered a lot, and there's a lot going on there. But let's just kind of wrap this up and sort of see that what we've covered here. Okay, the full form syntax of a commandlet is its expanded version, where I'm properly naming the conventions of the parameter and specifying what I'm after. I really encourage you to live there. Even after running PowerShell for 10 years, I still script that way and I still write that way 99% of the time, because the full form is also legible, it's understandable, and it rarely mixes me up in case I mix up the parameters, because some of them are mandatory, some are optional. So all parameters are either mandatory or optional. And the way you can tell is either looking at the square brackets around the entire thing, or using the -full command with our help and reading about that parameter. It's either true that it's mandatory or false that it's mandatory. And if it's false mandatory, it's therefore optional. So all of them fall into the category of optional or mandatory. Now, some are named, some are positional, and the difference is, do I need to include the argument when I'm or do I need to include the name of the parameter when I'm putting the argument in? If it's a named parameter, yes, you have to. It will not work. It can be truncated, but it will not work without the name. If it's positional, I don't need the name, but I have to put it in the right order. Think of that example with get event log. The first position has to be the log name. The second position had to be the instance ID. If I mix them up, PowerShell argues with me unless I put the name of the argument in, and I'm good. Switch parameters can be on or off. I simply add them to trigger some other action. We saw now -full when we're using help, -online when we're using help, -examples when we're using help. And now we've seen -whatif, -confirm, -verbose. These trigger an extra element here. And for the most part, you'll find that they are very simple and easy to find using that dash in IntelliSense. They'll tell you whether they work there. So what I hope is that now you can determine by looking at the help and looking at the syntax of the parameter set to determine which parameters are mandatory and optional, whether they're positional or named, or whether they're a switch or something different. And now, as we start building our commandlets, we'll be able to research them and hopefully try to keep them in the right order. I hope that helped. See you in the next video.